Welcome to this video on the potential fight of Rico Verhoeven versus Francis Ngannou that I think really might be announced sooner rather than later, and we'll get straight into why I think that. So both fighters are looking for a fight. Usyk versus Verhoeven was a great fight. People really now know Rico's name outside of boxing, outside of kickboxing, and in the boxing world and in the public eye, facing Usyk and doing incredibly well against the best of this era in boxing, which really is giving him a massive name. Francis Ngannou obviously has already pretty much done what Rico has done in facing Fury and doing incredibly well there, getting himself a big name as well. You know, he lost, but did incredibly well in that fight, and I thought Ngannou may even have won the Tyson Fury fight. Got beat by AJ, but them two fights gave him a big name in boxing. Already was a world champion in MMA in the UFC, so that's I would say more fans, more public viewing and public eye on the UFC than there is for Rico in kickboxing in the majority of the world. So both of them have quite big followings. The public, the people who don't really watch boxing but will buy a pay-per-view or will buy a fight. If there's two big names on it, they will buy a fight between these two. They've done enough to establish their name, so they are in that type of ballpark now where a fight between the two of them really does make sense. And also, with the situation they're currently both in boxing, it makes sense as well, because you think Rico doesn't sound like he's going to get the Usyk fight for a rematch, even though the controversial 11th round stoppage. Francis Ngannou is sort of struggling to find fights, and it's not really happening for him. And this fight would make an incredible amount of money for both, and they're both looking for a fight. So why wouldn't it happen? I think it makes so much sense. And I think it makes even more sense with, someone like MVP, 100%. MVP's already, looking to do massive fight cards with some big names that probably aren't, the guys going for a world championship, but are massive names and do bring in big views. And that's Rico and Ngannou all over. I don't think they'll go for a world championship, but again, massive names in combat sports in general, and really will pull in a lot wider set of fans than even some very good, even world champion boxers. So, it makes total sense from an MVP sort of point of view, and it makes sense from both fighters' point of view. And I think this is just clear, could easily get you a main event, and that is probably the hardest bit for an MVP, is finding a main event that actually brings in a massive amount of names to the sport, and that's the key. And I think this makes total financial sense. Both would make a lot of money from it as well, which makes sense for the fighters financially as well. And look, it would fill a massive. It'll fill the top of a massive fight night or fight card for MVP, and I do think MVP is the most likely organisation to put this on. Obviously, there'll always be talk with these two fighters. Will it be boxing? And we've talked about it. I think it probably will be, but MVP are now trying to get into MMA. That's clear. That's an announcement that's just happened with their merger with PFL, their purchase of PFL, sorry. And it might be, I think it's a combination. I can't remember. I think it's combination, but it'll all be done under the MVP banner. And so, look, PFL's really gone. It's now MVP MMA. Does this fight make even more sense that they've suddenly started trying to get into that, and they need a big starting fight card? Really is a real show of intent. They need a massive event to really show, look, we're here, and we're here to try and challenge the UFC, as any MMA organisation is trying to do. I think again that works as well. I think it lends itself to be more advantageous for Ngannou, obviously, with him fighting in MMA, not on the stand-up. I think it's probably more the stand-up with the takedown defense and the takedown offense. We saw Francis Ngannou beat Cyril Gane to defend his heavyweight championship by taking him down when he had, I think, an injury to his leg or something like that. So, look, clearly with the takedowns, things like that, Ngannou definitely has an advantage and will win in that side. So I think it sort of lends itself to Rico probably not wanting to do that. And Rico, obviously, only having one fight in boxing and wanting to establish himself in boxing, he's going to want to fight in boxing. That's clear. He's not going to want to try and transition into MMA. He realises unless he's, in like most fighters, what Ngannou's found, if you're not in the UFC trying to do MMA, it's very tough for a heavyweight of that caliber. It becomes a problem of trying to find matches. It's just so difficult, and boxing gives you a lot more potential fights, and the fact you've got a big name, a lot of heavyweights may give it a chance. The fighters who are established in boxing may give it a chance, and you make a massive payday. I think the MMA side limits them quite often. MVP, look, they've combined with PFL, but look, Ngannou was with PFL and he had problems trying to find fights. There wasn't really many out there. He struggled to keep active, and that's not something even Ngannou's going to want to go back to. So why would even Ngannou? Yes, it may give him an advantage, but he understands if he has an MMA fight, that puts him one step further away from a boxing fight. So unlikely he could get this as a boxing fight, and Rico would probably prefer that. So look, I think 100% if it's going to go ahead, it's going to be boxing. I don't see how, unless there is a massive chunk more money for a first event of the PFL combination with MVP under the MVP MMA banner. That's the only way I can see that going ahead is as MMA. But I think both fighters, to be honest, will be more happy if it's the same money. Boxing will be their choice to get that done and really try and establish a name in boxing to try and get more boxing fights in the future. But look, what do I think will happen in this fight? I think it'll be a very good fight. I think it's quite competitive for sure. I think Rico, he did incredibly well against Usyk to come in there and do that against the best of this era. But you got to think, Ngannou did incredibly well against Fury. He dropped Fury, Tyson Fury, and it wasn't this style Fury. It was a very high level Tyson Fury. Yes, he may have been coming a bit down from his peak powers, but he was still in there. He was still mostly there with the fighter we all know and who did incredibly well against Wilder and the rest of them. So look, may have been coming slightly down from that, but was still much more of that top heavyweight that we knew, and definitely a lot higher level than the Fury we're seeing currently fight now. So did incredibly well in that fight. Got beat by AJ, but look, many fighters get beat by AJ, and that was AJ again a good few fights ago before the Dubois fight. I think a lot more, getting more towards his prime than what we're seeing now as well. And look, Rico's only had one fight. So look, we can all say, look, Rico did incredibly well, which he did against Usyk, but sort of an unknown quantity. Now is a lot more known, has tape on him, sees how he boxes. I think it'd be a very competitive fight. I think it will do. I think if I had to guess now and I had to say who do I think wins, I think it's Rico, just because of the skill he showed in the Usyk fight. But one fight can be misleading. In the Fury fight, in Ngannou's fight with Fury, we thought, look, this guy did incredibly well. This guy's going to be dangerous for any heavyweight in boxing. And then we saw the AJ fight, and we saw levels, and we saw, right, once you see how this guy fights, it is very limited. So I do think Rico's slightly less limited in that sense. But look, Ngannou's got that type of power where he can drop people quite easily. Every heavyweight has, but Ngannou's got that slight bit more towards the Wilder power, where you go, that guy's going to drop you and you're going to stay dropped, and there's not much way of you coming back. And so, look, incredible fight if it does go ahead. I think MVP would be a great, would be the main organization to put it on, and it could even go like Netflix and things like that. And I bet both fighters would love that, just because more eyes. That's what these fighters need. More eyes on them to try and push their boxing future for both fighters, because that's exactly what both fighters want, is to be in boxing and get in big fights. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I think if it does go ahead, I think Rico probably wins it, but I think a very competitive fight, very good fight, and I think it shows both of them are a very good level of boxing, and I think that's key for both of them to go forward in their career, looking at these big paydays in boxing. So let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know who you think will put it on. Let me know who you think will win, and I'll catch you next time.